stood in that chamber once. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else. I stood in it. I carried Earth's words into it, and I watched those words get filed. The chamber was called the Deliberative Hall of the Varanthos Permanent Seat, though no one in the diplomatic corps used its full name after the first month. We called it the Hall. Sometimes, after enough sleepless nights in the attaché quarters on the station's residential tier, we called it other things. The hall seated 412 member delegates in curved white tiers that rose from a central dais like the inside of a shell, and it smelled of recycled air and old procedural paper, and whatever passed for ambition among species who had been governing themselves for 10,000 years. The translation matrix hummed above the floor like something alive, parsing 732 languages simultaneously into a clean, neutral signal that arrived in your earpiece with the cadence of a moderately tired civil servant reading a memo. It was meant to inspire awe. First 2 years of my posting it did. I was 31 years old when I arrived at Varanthos as junior attaché to Ambassador Calder Osi. I was 37 when I left. In between, the galaxy taught me what institutions do when the price of action is higher than the price of silence. The lesson took 4 attempts to fully land. I was a slow student. I believed, for longer than I should have, that institutions could be moved by the right argument, presented with sufficient precision in the correct procedural format. I believed this because I had been trained to believe it, and because I was surrounded by people who had built their lives on it, and because the alternative, that the argument was irrelevant, that the precision was irrelevant, that the procedure was the whole point, and the point was to have the procedure and not the outcome, was too large and too cold a thing to accept, until the evidence became impossible to dispute. The evidence took 4 petitions to become impossible to dispute. The Meridian Accord arrived at Varanthos Station 4 hours ago. I am telling this from the bridge of the Ardent Threshold, which is the lead ship of that fleet, and which is currently holding position at 15,000 kilometers off the station's primary docking ring, while the rest of the Accord's 880 warships complete their encirclement. I have been on this bridge for 11 hours. I have not left my station at the forward observer's console. Below us, though in space there is no below, only orientation. The station rotates at its standard quarter rotation per hour, its solar collector arrays spread wide, its running lights blinking their routine patterns. Because we have not yet told them we are here. We will in approximately 40 minutes. I think about the hall a great deal. I have thought about it for 6 years, which is how long it has been since I delivered our 4th petition, and watched the council reach for its archive stamp. 6 years is a long time to think about a room. Long enough that I can reconstruct it in complete detail. The height of the central dais, particular angle of the overhead light arrays, the soft hum of the translation matrix, the way the white tears caught the light from the ribbed panels and reflected it back downward, so that the chamber always seemed brighter than it had any right to be, as though light were being manufactured there specifically to suggest that clarity was taking place. Long enough that I've stopped feeling anything about it. The grief burned clean a long time ago. What remained after the burning is what brought me to this bridge. I should tell you about the colonies first. That is where this actually begins. Not in the hall, and not in the deliberations, and not in the procedural history of 4 petitions. All of that matters, but it only matters because of the colonies. The colonies are the weight at the center of everything. If you lose hold of them, the rest of the story becomes about process and institutions and intergalactic governance frameworks. And it is not about those things. It is about 11,000 people on a moon and the autumn term of a school. Orvith Station, which we called Orvith 3, distinguish it from the relay installation of the same name in the Herath Corridor, was a mining and agricultural community on the 4th moon of gas giant in the Kethara sovereignty's outer reach. 11,000 people, mostly extraction workers and their families, along with the 2nd-generation settlers who had been born on that moon and knew no other sky, and who had built the particular density of local life that a community builds. When it has been in one place long enough to have regulars at the same fist counter, and children who fight over the same patches of the playground. The Kithara slaver caste had been observing the Orbit system for approximately 40 years before they acted, according to the intelligence assessments I was shown later. The moon's mineral profile was useful. The labor population that was already in place was more useful still. In the Kithara system of economic organization, the most efficient workforce was one that did not require wages, rotation contracts, repatriation arrangements, or any of the accumulated machinery by which a species acknowledges that the people doing its work are people. They came in the third month of what we were still calling the Kithara trade dispute. It was not a dispute. I understand that now, though I did not understand it completely then. It was a period during which the slaver caste was conducting a systematic assessment, of which human settlements were too remote for a rapid response from Earth, too small to command significant political attention, too economically valuable to leave ungathered. Orbit 3 satisfied all three criteria at the top of their analysis. The Kithara moved on a Thursday. Our colonists on Orbit 3 had a Thursday. They had mornings and coffee substitutes and shift schedules, and a school that was halfway through its autumn term, and 2 restaurants that doubled as bars on the weekends, and a community medical post with 3 physicians, and a local news feed that mostly covered extraction output numbers and weather on the surface below, and the occasional sports results, relayed from Earth with a 14-hour delay. Ordinary life, which is to say irreplaceable life, which is to say the only kind there is. Kithara came with 3 seizure vessels and a complement of enforcement troops. Within 14 hours, Orbit 3 was no longer a human colony. It was a Kithara labor acquisition. The terminology is their own. I use it because precision matters, and because the distance in their language between what they did and what they called it is itself a significant fact. Of the 11,000 residents, 912 were killed outright. Those who resisted, those who were too old for a productive work term by Kithara standards, those who were too young, those whose medical profiles indicated limited labor utility. The remaining 10,088 were processed and distributed to labor facilities throughout the Kithara sovereignty's interior. The word processed is also their own terminology. I use it for the same reason. Earth received the distress signal 17 hours after the seizure began. The signal cut out before it was complete. I want to be precise about the sequence what followed, because precision is the only honest way to tell this story, and because I spent 6 years among people for whom precision was the primary virtue, and because I want to honor that impulse even as I describe its limits. Earth lodged an emergency petition with the Galactic Accord Council within 72 hours of the signal cutout. Ambassador Osi drafted it himself in the small hours of the morning, at the desk in his office that looked out through a narrow viewport toward the station's inner docking bay. I sat beside him while he wrote. The petition named the offense explicitly, and without diplomatic softening: the seizure of Orbit 3, the 912 dead, 10,088 taken into forced labor, the violation of 4 separate accord statutes governing the sovereignty of settled worlds, and the prohibition on the involuntary transfer of sentient populations. It requested emergency intervention, requested the dispatch of an accord enforcement delegation. It requested at minimum a formal censure. The council heard the petition in the hall, in session, with the full delegate body present. This was itself considered a significant response. Emergency sessions with full attendance were not. And Ambassador Osi had interpreted the promptness as a positive sign. He was an optimistic man, Calder Osi. It was not a flaw exactly. It was the shape of how he understood the world. And the world had not yet finished reshaping it. The council deliberated for 6 hours across 2 sessions. I sat in the attaché gallery above the second tier and watched 412 delegates deliberate. I heard jurisdictional arguments and sovereignty arguments and resource framework arguments and procedural precedent arguments, rendered through the translation matrix in the same calm civil servant cadence, regardless of the passion behind them. At the end of the second session, the council issued its determination. The matter was referred to the Committee on Interspecies Resource, arrangements for further study, pending a full procedural review of the council's jurisdictional standing in the Kithara Outer Territories. The committee had a standard review period of 8 months. Orvith 3 had been gone for 3 weeks, Mix. I will not recount all of it. I will give you the shape of it because the shape is what matters and because giving you every detail of every session would take longer than the sessions themselves took, and I do not believe that is the appropriate use of the time remaining. Colvin's settlement was on the second continent of Drevhari, a terraformed world in the adjacent corridor, one we had been building for 60 years, full planetary settlement, with a population of 44,000, established farmers and manufacturing workers, and a service economy, and 2 functioning cities with hospitals and courts and transit systems. A population that thought of itself as Drevaron first and Earth descended second is the kind of rootedness that takes a generation and a half to build, and that cannot be rebuilt anywhere else, because the particular place is. The Kithara moved on Kolvan 11 months after Orvith 3. The method was identical. The targeting logic was identical. Remote enough, underdefended, economically productive. They had studied Orvith 3 and concluded that the response, 412 delegates, 6 hours, a committee referral, was acceptable. They had priced the action. 18,000 dead in the initial seizure and the resistance that followed it. 26,000 taken. Earth's second petition was filed within 48 hours. The Council referred it to the same committee, which was still 9 weeks into its review period for the first petition, and noted formally that consolidating the two matters for simultaneous review was the procedurally correct approach, and would result in a more comprehensive analysis than would be possible through separate reviews. The committee's review period was extended to accommodate the additional matter. I sat through that session too. I watched the consolidation motion pass by a vote of 341 to 71. I wrote the vote count in my personal log that evening, because I wanted to remember it exactly. And then I sat in my attaché quarters for a long time looking at the viewport without any particular thought, just the view of the docking bay and the numbers in my head. Harath Colony, a medical research station on Harath 9, population 6,000, including 312 physicians and researchers, from 7 different species, not all of them human. The Kithara took it anyway. 1,200 dead, 4,800 taken, including 204 non-human researchers who were citizens of 3 separate Accord member worlds, none of which had any active dispute with the Kithara sovereignty, and none of whose governments had anticipated that their citizens would be classified as incidental acquisitions in a labor seizure targeting a human colony. Earth filed its third petition jointly with 2 other member world governments whose citizens were now in Kithara labor facilities. We argued, in that petition, that the taking of non-human Accord member citizens constituted a violation of the Accord's own core statutes on member world protections. Not only the statutes governing human settlements, but the statutes that the Accord had been invoking to justify its own authority for 11,000 years. We argued that if the Council could not act to protect its own members' citizens from enslavement, question of its authority over anything else became difficult to sustain. Ambassador Ozzy presented this argument himself, on the floor, 50 minutes. It was one of the finest pieces of diplomatic argumentation I have ever heard. He was precise and thorough, and he named every statute, and he named every dead, and he named every member citizen in Kithara captivity, and he did not raise his voice once. The Council deliberated for 4 hours. The determination on the third petition noted that the joint petition raised important and complex set questions regarding the intersection of member world protections and resource arrangement frameworks in contested outer territories, that these questions merited careful and thorough analysis, that the matter had been referred to the Committee on Interspecies Resource Arrangements, consolidation with the ongoing review, and that the Council was monitoring the situation with appropriate attention. The Council was monitoring the situation. I have tried over 6 years to understand what that costs a person, to be a delegate in that hall, to hear that phrase read aloud as a formal determination, and to feel nothing wrong in the saying of it. I cannot do it. I am not built the way they are built, but I have had enough time to stop being surprised by it, and to start trying to understand it, And what I understand is this. They were not indifferent in the way an enemy is indifferent, with its back turned and its attention elsewhere. They were indifferent in the way a system is indifferent. A system that has been running long enough that its procedures have become identical with its conscience, so that the proper filing of a petition and the proper tabling of a response feels, to everyone inside it, like a moral act. Form is the content. The process is the answer. They deliberated, therefore they had taken the matter seriously. They referred it to committee, therefore they had ensured it would receive expert attention. They monitored, therefore they were engaged. Every action was correct. Every determination was appropriate. The archive was complete. 11,000 people on Orbit 3, 44,000 on Kolvan, 6,000 on Herath, while the committee reviewed. The fourth colony was Merit Station. Merit was the largest of the four by a significant margin. Population, 219,000. A full transit hub on a moderately trafficked corridor, a commercial district, and a manufacturing sector, and schools and hospitals, and a university, with 4,000 enrolled students from 11 different worlds, not all of them human. A university. I mention that specifically because a university is a particular kind of thing. It is the investment a community makes in its own future, the statement that says we expect to be here long enough that it is worth building an institution to teach our children and our children's children, and the children of other species who want to learn alongside them. It is a long-range statement. It is the most optimistic thing a community can do. Merit was not remote. Merit was visible, moderately trafficked, large enough to have been noticed. Ambassador Osi had argued, privately, in the evenings after the third petition, the Kethara would not move against Maret because the calculus was different at this scale. Because a seizure of 219,000 people was not an outer territory resource action but a major territorial event, and major territorial events had consequences that even the slaver caste's internal planners would recognize as prohibitive. He was wrong, and the wrongness of it broke him in a way that I watched happen in real time over the 4 days it took the Kethara to process Merit Station, TUS, and which I could not stop, and which I do not think was his fault in any meaningful sense, because the think that broke him was not a miscalculation on his part. The thing that broke him was the discovery that the calculus he had used, the one that said visible targets have natural protection because consequences exist, assumed an enforcement mechanism. It assumed that someone, somewhere, would impose the consequences. It assumed the architecture of deterrence was maintained by something beyond the architecture itself. The Kethara had watched 3 petitions proceed to committee referral. They understood the architecture. They came to Merit Station with 9 seizure vessels and full occupation forces. They were not quick about it this time. Earth 3 had been 14 hours. Maret took 4 days, which is how long it takes to process 219,000 people through a thorough labor intake system, to screen, to categorize, to assign, to transport. The Kethara were orderly about it. They were thorough. 62,000 dead. Those were the resistors, the elderly, the children under the age threshold, the medically unfit, the people from the university who had been categorized as insufficiently productive for a standard work assignment, and who were, in the Kethara's accounting, waste. 157,000 taken. I was in the attaché office when the first partial relay reached us. I read it once, I set it down carefully on the desk. I sat still for a long time, then I went to find Ambassador Osi. Not describe what he looked like when he read it. That belongs to him. I will tell you that we sat together in his office for 4 hours, and that we wrote the 4th petition together, line by line, with the viewport dark, because it was the deep night cycle, and neither of us had thought to adjust the ambient light. When it was finished, it was the most precisely argued document I have ever read in any language. It named every offense, every statute, every dead across all 4 colonies. It named Orbit 3 and Kolvan and Harath and Merit Station. It named the 912 dead, and the 18,000 dead, and the 1,200 dead, and the 62,000 dead. And it named, as a separate count, the total taken, 191,088 human beings, and 204 non-human human Accord member citizens in Kethera labor facilities as of the filing date, cited the 3 previous petitions and the 3 committee referrals and the monitoring determinations, invoked Article 7 of the Accord Charter, the provision authorizing the Council to direct enforcement action in cases of documented mass atrocity against the populations of member worlds, and it argued that the 4-year record constituted not merely documented atrocity, but a pattern of escalating atrocity enabled by the Council's procedural responses, and that the Council's decision on the 4th petition would constitute the clearest available statement of what the Accord's authority actually meant in practice and what it did not. Ambassador Osi wrote the final paragraph. Watched him write it. It was addressed not to the committee framework or the jurisdictional analysis, but to the delegates themselves, to the 412 individuals in the curved white tiers, and it said, with his characteristic precision and, without any of the diplomatic softening he had spent 22 years mastering, "You have the power to end this, and you have had it at every point in this history, and the only question before you is whether you will use it." We filed it at 0400 station time. The Council convened an emergency session within 6 hours, which was the fastest response we had received across all 4 petitions. The full delegate body was present. 18 delegates requested the floor over the 2 sessions. Ambassador Osi spoke for 45 minutes. I sat in the attaché gallery, and I watched him and I thought, he still believes this will work, even now. 4 years of evidence and 280,000 dead and 191,000 more in Kethera labor facilities. He believes the institution can be moved by the right argument made with sufficient precision. I did not think this was foolish. I thought it was the only thing left to be, under the circumstances, and that he had earned the right to it by 22 years of building his life on the proposition. The Council deliberated for 9 hours. I stayed in the gallery for all 9. I ate something from my bag at some point. I no longer remember what. I watched the translation matrix render 700 voices into 700 coherent arguments, and I watched the procedural arguments and the jurisdictional arguments and the sovereignty arguments and the precedent arguments and the framework arguments and the stability arguments cycle through the chamber in various combinations. Some delegates were eloquent on behalf of action. They named the dead as well. They made the case with force and specificity. I want to note that, because it would be inaccurate to describe the hall as uniform in its response. There were 412 delegates in those tiers, and they were not all the same. Some of them understood what was being asked and what the cost of not answering it was. They were outvoted 308 to 104. At the end of the 9th hour, presiding delegate read the Council's determination. The depopulation of 4 human colony worlds by the Kethera sovereignty, 11,000 on Vith 3, 44,000 on Kolvan, 6,000 on Harath, 219,000 on Maret Station, was, the Council found, a matter arising primarily from territorial and resource disputes within the Kethera sovereignty's recognized sphere of influence. The Galactic Accord's jurisdictional standings was not clearly established under existing charter frameworks, and the appropriate institutional response was continued diplomatic engagement and good faith negotiation between Earth and the Kethera sovereignty, with the Council's good offices available to facilitate such dialogue. The Committee on Interspecies Resource Arrangements would prepare a comprehensive framework report. The Council would continue to monitor the situation. Then she reached for the archive stamp. I have heard that sound many times since. The specific mechanical sound of the Council's archive stamp engaging, a soft, definitive click that the hall's acoustics carried to the gallery with surprising clarity, as though the room had been designed with that moment in mind. In the 9 hours of deliberation, I had heard 200 voices in 7 languages, and the translation matrix, rendering all of them, and the shuffling of procedural papers, and the tap of delegate notification panels and the ambient respiration of 412 beings doing what they understood to be their jobs. And then, at the end of all of it, in the silence that followed the last word of the determination, there was that click. Clean and final and very quiet. I did not move from my seat for a long time after the hall emptied. Then I went to find Ambassador Osi, and I told him I was resigning my posting and returning to Earth, and he looked at me for a long time, long enough that I thought he was going to argue, and I had prepared for that. I had a version of the conversation ready, and then he said, very quietly, that he understood. He did not try to persuade me otherwise. He was a good man, Calder Osi, and I think he may have envied me the leaving, though he would never have said it. He stayed, because someone had to, because the job of his life had been to believe in the architecture of multilateral governance, and he could not abandon it simply because it had failed 4 times with increasing scale, because, if he abandoned it, there was nothing left but what was coming, and he knew what was coming better than most. I returned to Earth on a standard transit vessel. The journey took 11 days. I spent most of them on the observation deck, watching the star field move, thinking about the sound of an archive stamp, thinking about the vote count, 308 to 104. Thinking about the particular quality of the silence in the hall after the reading ended. Not stunned, not grieving, just procedural. The silence of a body that has completed its work and is prepared to move to the next item on the agenda. What I am about to tell you about the 14 months following my return is not something I have described in detail before, and some of it remains classified, and some of it remains unresolved in ways that would serve no one to publicize. What I can tell you is the shape of it. Earth had been building quietly for approximately 4 months before I returned. The decision had been made at a level above the diplomatic corps, above the conventional defense apparatus, by people who had been watching 4 petitions go into the hall and come out stamped and filed, who had been running their own parallel accounting, and who had arrived at a conclusion that did not require a 5th petition and would not benefit from one. They were not rash people. They were not people given to gestures or to the performance of rage. They had spent careers in the relevant offices, and they understood the precision of long experience, what institutions do when confronted with problems whose solutions cost more than their archival. They had decided, without public declaration, without ultimatum, without informing the Council or the Cathara sovereignty or anyone else who would use the information to prepare a response, that the problem they were facing required an answer in a different register entirely. The Meridian Accord was not named until the 4th month of its assembly. Before that, it was a construction program distributed across 6 orbital yards and 2 deep space fabrication installations, described in the budget allocations as infrastructure modernization and reserve fleet capacity expansion. The people doing the building knew what they were building. The people authorizing the budgets knew what they were authorizing. The Cathara Sovereignty's intelligence services and the Council's standard monitoring apparatus, to every other body that had been watching Earth's diplomatic posture for 90 years and calibrating their assessments based on 4 petitions and 4 committee referrals, did not know what was happening. Earth was careful in a way that an institution with a comprehensive and well-indexed archive does not expect from a species it has spent 9 years managing with procedural correspondence. 880 warships. The number was not chosen for symbolic weight. The analysts who designed the Accord's composition ran precise calculations about what it would take to neutralize the Cathara sovereignty's defensive capabilities simultaneously across all major installations, compress the response timeline to near zero, to ensure the operation's completion before any council member world could formally convene to deliver it. Because the architects of the Meridian Accord had noticed, with some care, that deliberation was the mechanism by which the Council's institutional inertia reproduced itself, and they had designed an operation for which there was no deliberation window. 880 was the number at which those calculations closed. They included what the planners called the archive margin, extra hull count sufficient to complete all operational objectives, even under a 20% attrition scenario, because what was being built could not be built twice, and could not be undone, and was not going to be carried out in a form that left anything complete. I was recruited in the 8th month. I had been home for 4 months, doing very little of anything, When I received a communication from an office I recognized, asking if I would meet. I went. I was shown what had been built and told what was planned and asked. Not whether I approved, because by that point, my approval was not the operative question. Whether I would serve aboard the lead ship as forward observer and council liaison. The reason was specific. I had been posted to Varanthos for 6 years. I had delivered Earth's 4th petition in person. I knew the station's internal layout, its administrative rhythms, its emergency response protocols, its shelter architecture, and I was therefore the person most precisely qualified for the particular task they needed me to perform. I said yes. The Accord departed across a 2-week window from 3 separate assembly points, in groups calibrated to remain below the threshold that would trigger the Council's standard long-range alert protocols. The groups reassembled in a dark transit corridor 17 light-years from Varanthos, when the full fleet convened there for the first time. All 880 ships at station keeping, the ardent threshold at the center, the formation so large that it did not fit cleanly within any single sensor sweep. I stood at the viewport of the briefing deck and looked at it for a long time. I have been asked what I felt in that moment. I felt the recognition that something was finally going to be answered. That is the most precise description I can give. The Accord was not beautiful in the way a natural thing is beautiful. It was beautiful in the way a completed proof is beautiful. The beauty of sufficiency, of the answer matching the question at every point, nothing left over, and nothing missing. Admiral Prek Vasquez addressed the fleet by comms from the Threshold's bridge. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He was not a man given to speeches, and he did not give one. He said the fleet's operational mandate was precise and limited to specified targets, that the rules of engagement were clear and had been reviewed, that every member of the fleet knew what had been done and why it warranted this response, and that he expected them to execute with the discipline the occasion required. He said we would be at Varanthos in 11 hours, and that they should rest if they could. Then he closed the channel. I did not rest. I should say something about the 11 hours, because they were not simply waiting. Waiting implies passivity, and the 11 hours were not passive. They were the specific attentiveness of a person who has been preparing for something for a long time, and is now close enough to it that preparation has become the act itself. Every hour I ran the schematics. Every 2 hours I checked the recording, because I doubted it, but because the act of checking was its own form of keeping faith. With Orvith 3, with Kolvan, with Harath, with Meridian Station, with the 104 delegates who voted the other way, and whose vote meant nothing, because the 308 voted against them had the count. I thought about those 104. I wondered what they had felt, filing out of the hall after the determination reading. Whether they had gone back to their residential quarters and sat with the weight of having been in the minority, with having argued and lost and knowing what the loss meant and being powerless to change it. I thought they probably had. I thought they probably still did, wherever they were this morning. On Varanthos, or in transit, or on their home worlds. I hope they are somewhere safe. I mean that without irony and without reservation. Their vote was the right vote. And it went nowhere, and none of what followed is their accounting to carry. I spent the 11 hours at the Forward Observer console, going through Varanthos Station's schematics from memory, cross-checking them against the blueprints in the Accord's operational files, running the internal layout again and again. The docking ring, the delegate residential tier, the administrative core, the hall's lower service corridors, the emergency shelter alcoves, the specific alcove, 17 meters from the duty archivist's intake desk in the lower corridor, which I had used during a pressure drill in my 3rd year, and which was rated for sustained atmospheric breach. I ran the broadcast relay architecture, the frequencies, the amplitude ranges. I ran the recording we had brought. Recording is 7 seconds long. It is an audio capture from my personal communicator, which I had running in the attaché gallery during the 4th petition's determination reading, a habit I had developed after 3rd petition because I wanted the verbatim record in case we ever needed it for a legal challenge. The 7 seconds contain the final clause of the Council's determination and the click of the archive stamp. The presiding delegate's voice, reading the final words of a thing that had just killed 280,000 people by the logic of its own inaction. And then the click. 7 seconds. We were going to broadcast it on all council standard frequencies through the Varanthos Central Relay at full amplitude, and the galaxy was going to hear it. And what the galaxy did with the hearing of it afterward was not my calculation to make. Calculation was simpler. The Cathara response began 6 hours before we reached Varanthos. That part of the operation had its own commanders, and its own crews, and its own targeting sequence, and it is not my station to describe it in detail. What I can tell you is that the analysts who built the 880 ship figure were correct in their calculations, and that the Cathara sovereignty's major labor installations are no longer operational as of this morning, and that the human populations from all 4 colony seizures, those who survived 6 years in Cathara labor facilities, which was not all of them, which was fewer than it should have been, but which was many thousands, are now in the process of being reached by the Accord's relief components, which are not warships and which were positioned to arrive within hours of the all-clear. I think about them sometimes, the ones who were still there, what those 6 years were like. Whether any of them understood, in the last few days, that something had changed in the conditions around them. Something in the behavior of the guards. Something in the supply deliveries. Something in the electromagnetic environment that a person learns to read after years of deprivation. I do not know. I hope they felt something shift. I hope it came to them the way a change in air pressure comes, before the weather turns. When the body knows before the mind has finished reasoning. The station's running lights below us have been blinking their standard 3-second pulse for the last 4 hours. Regular, unhurried, routine. The duty staff on Varanthos will be awake. They will have received fragmentary sensor reports from the outer Cathara perimeter over the past 6 hours. Incomplete signals, anomalous traffic, gaps in the pattern that the Council's monitoring apparatus is trained to notice. They will be doing what their protocols require. Logging the anomalies, preparing escalation packets, reaching for the intake forms. The hall's lower service corridor will have its lights on. The duty archivist will be at the intake desk with something hot to drink, reading the overnight log, doing the job correctly. I know that person, not by name. I never learned the night cycle archivist name in my 6 years of posting, which is a failure of mine I recognize now. But I know the desk and the corridor and the routine because I worked late in that building for 6 years, and the duty archivist was always there, and the intake log was always running, and the something hot was always in the same corner of the desk. A person doing their job conscientiously in an institution that processes the world, forms. They are not responsible for what the forms produced. They did not cast the vote of 308 to 104. They are there because they took a posting that paid the rent, and they showed up to every shift. Pre-transmission directive went to them 4 minutes ago. It was localized, targeted to the duty archivist's station frequency, in a language I know they understand, and it told them to seal themselves. Inside the emergency shelter, alcove 17 meters down the corridor. Effective immediately. It told them they had 4 minutes. I do not know whether they believed it. I do not know whether they moved. I hope they did. I sent it because I know where the alcove is, and because I am not building a monument to indifference here. I am answering one. The face shape that I have thought about carefully, and the duty archivist is not inside that shape. 22 minutes. Admiral Vasquez's voice comes over the bridge comm, even and measured, with the quality that comes from very long practice at sounding unremarkable while standing at the center of unremarkable things. He says, "Forward communications prepare primary broadcast array." He says, "All stations confirm operational readiness." He says, "Observer, you are cleared to transmit on my mark." I say, "Confirmed." The broadcast array charges. I feel the vibration of it through the console under my hands. A low, steady harmonic that the hull carries up through the frame of the chair, across 879 other ships in the encirclement. I cannot feel anything, but I know they are there the way you know water in the dark. Not by seeing it, but by the change in the quality of the air and the sense of a mass that your body registers before your eyes do. 880 ships. The largest single deployment in Earth's history, assembled in 14 months, in silence, without declaration, without ultimatum. Because there was no one left to deliver an ultimatum to, who would have treated it as anything other than a document to be filed, and a situation to be monitored. The weapons officer 2 positions to my right on this bridge has a daughter who is 11 years old, and who writes him letters that he prints and keeps in his locker. I know this because I walked past his locker when it was open one morning, in the assembly transit, and I saw the stack of them and recognized what they were. The handwriting, the drawings in the margins, the specific informational density of a child who has not yet learned to edit herself. The sensor operator to my left was posted to Meridian Station for 2 years before the seizure, and she was on leave on Earth when it happened, and has not spoken of it in the 6 months I have known her. Not once, not to me, not to anyone I have asked. She does not need to. The grief has had time to complete its process. What is here now, on this bridge and across this fleet, is not grief anymore. It is what grief becomes when it is given long enough, and when it knows what it is for understands that no one else is going to answer question for you. It is not rage. I want to be precise about that because it matters. There is no rage on this bridge. No shouting. No performance of wrath. No one gripping the edge of a console waiting for permission to be furious. What there is has no heat to it. It is the thing instance on the farthest past the cold and the weight and the long sleepless nights, in the place where the calculation has finally finished and the answer is clear. And the only remaining task is to execute it with precision. That is what 280,000 dead and 191,000 more in labor facilities, and 4 petitions and 9 years produces in the end, in the people who survive it and decide to answer it. Not rage. Something colder and more patient and more certain of itself, because it has had long enough to be certain. 12 minutes. I have sat with the question of whether what we are doing is clean for 6 years. And I have never resolved it to my satisfaction. And I do not expect to resolve it now. It is not clean. 280,000 dead is not clean. 9 years of archive stamps is not clean. What is coming is not clean. None of it is clean, and I do not think it was ever going to be. And the version of this story in which we found some other avenue, some 5th petition, some 6th, some framework report that changed the arithmetic of the Council's deliberation, is not a version I can locate in the evidence. 4th petition was already every avenue. Ambassador Osi gave it 45 minutes of the finest argument in the English language, and the vote was 308 to 104. I am not going to perform anguish about this. The anguish happened. It happened in that gallery in real time, across 9 hours, in the small hours of the morning after, in the 11 days on the transit ship watching the starfield. It happened, and it was real, and it is done now. What I am left with is not anguish. It is a simple factual statement about the world. When the system that is supposed to protect people decides that protecting them costs more than archiving them, someone else has to decide what that costs. We have decided. 7 minutes. The station is lit and rotating below us, its solar arrays wide, its pulse steady, doing what it has done for 11,000 years. I have looked at that station from shuttle approaches dozens of times, always in the context of landing, of going to work, of another day in the hall, and another session in the gallery, and another determination to be drafted and filed. Looking at it now, this distance and this angle, I am aware that it is a large and old, and in its way remarkable thing. A permanent seat of governance maintained, cross millennia, by the combined effort of hundreds of species, the physical embodiment of the proposition that beings different enough from each other to have gone to war instead can choose to build an institution rather than a battlefield. That proposition is not nothing. It is genuinely not nothing. The hall with its curved white tiers and its translation matrix was built by people who believed that the architecture of deliberation stand in for the architecture of violence. And that belief produced something that lasted 11,000 years, and I will not pretend that is not real. What I will say is that the architecture of deliberation requires, as its load-bearing element, the willingness to act on what the deliberation concludes. Without that element, the architecture does not stand. It stands the appearance of standing. It files 2 minutes. Admiral Vasquez, transmit. I press the key. 7 seconds. Presiding delegate's voice, reading the final clause of the fourth petition's determination, and then the click. Then one sentence, in Earth Standard, and in 6 council languages, in the register of a formal diplomatic communication, without heat, without flourish, Earth has concluded its review of the situation and has taken the appropriate action. Then the Meridian Accord's operational directive commences. I do not look away from the viewport. People will want to know what it felt like, and I have thought about how to answer honestly. What I can tell you is that it felt like the conclusion of a long piece of work. The flat, specific feeling of finishing a document you have been writing for 9 years, setting it down, and knowing that everything that needed to be said has been said, and that the saying of it is now complete. Triumph. Triumph implies a contest with an uncertain outcome, and this was not that. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction implies a balance restored, and the balance here cannot be restored. 280,000 dead do not come back. Not vindication, because vindication requires someone to have acknowledged the wrong, and what was happening outside the viewport was not acknowledgement. It was accounting. The simple final act of bringing a tally into correspondence with what the tally required. That is what it felt like. 280,000 dead. The council logged 4 petitions and called it an internal matter. Earth had 880 warships, and we called it something else. The galaxy went quiet on all council standard frequencies that morning. In the silence that followed, it learned something about the species that had been filing petitions into that hall for 9 years. It learned what we become when the filing is finished. It learned that we count, not the way a committee counts, not for the record, for the archive, not for the ongoing review. We count the way a people counts when they have been made to understand that no one else is going to do it for them. We count the dead, and we remember the names, and we hold the number for as long as we need to hold it. When the holding is done, and the window for every other answer has closed, we do not deliberate. We do not refer it to the committee. We do not monitor the situation. We do not reach for the stamp. The silence on those frequencies was not the silence of a galaxy appalled. It was the silence of something very old and very settled learning for the first time, at scale, what it had enabled. It will have to decide what to do with that learning. That is not my calculation. My calculation ended when I pressed the key. What the galaxy builds or fails to build in the space this morning opened. That belongs to what comes next. 2. The people who will have to live in it and govern it and decide what kind of institutions they want, holding the weight of the law. I stayed at my console for 3 more hours. The ardent threshold held its position. The operational directive ran its course with the precision the analysts had built into it, and the Accord's operational log filled line by line with confirmations, the way any piece of long work fills as it is completed. Not in a rush but steadily, one item resolving after another until the list is done and there is nothing left on it. Then I stood up, thanked the bridge crew, who nodded, in the specific way of people who have finished a difficult, necessary thing and have no words for it that aren't already implied by the doing of it. And I walked to the observation deck. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the duty archivist and whether they had reached the shelter in time, and I believe they had, because I gave them 4 minutes and 17 meters is not far, and because I needed to believe it and because the evidence for it is the absence of a reason for otherwise. I thought about Ambassador Osi, who is still alive and who I have still not contacted, because there is not yet a form for that conversation, and I do not know when there will be. I thought about the 104 delegates and where they were this morning. I thought about the 308. And then I stopped thinking about the hall, which is the first time in 6 years that I have done so for any sustained period, and I thought instead about Orbit 3, about the school that was halfway through its autumn term, about 11,000 people who had a specific Thursday with a specific weather pattern on the surface below the moon, with a specific set of shift schedules and a specific afternoon in the community of people who had been building something there for a generation. About the morning they had, before the Caesar vessels arrived. The last morning they had, that was just a morning, without weight, without the knowledge of what was coming. About the 10,088 who were taken and who did not know, in that moment, whether anyone had noticed, whether anyone was counting, whether the signal had reached anyone who would do anything other than file it. Someone noticed. Someone was counting. The signal reached people who did everything they were supposed to do first, and when that was exhausted, did what was left. I sat with them for a while, on the observation deck of the ardent threshold, the star field outside the viewport, and the Accord's 880 ships around me in the dark. Then I went to get something to eat, because the work was done, and because the living still have mornings, and the living still have coffee, and that is not a small thing. It is not a small thing at all.